Hailsa, Nwesa Hale. Welcome back to the Frithstead Fireside, the Setish podcast. I'm Folcweard, and this is episode 5, The Cost of Clarity, recorded live. So, I suppose before we delve into this week's discussion, for those listening, I hope you've had a good past month. For me, it's been really good actually. It's as always, it's been very busy, but rewarding. But it always seems like no matter when I want to slow life down, it doesn't happen. Busyness is just a part of things. But that's okay. If it's productive and beneficial busyness, can't complain, right? Mm. Now, I'm not saying that there's been nothing to complain about, but when you truly don't sweat the small stuff, you keep a positive attitude and you put into practice the things that we've been discussing. That is the content from the previous episodes. Well, slowly but surely, life does get better, but it's always slowly but surely. Nothing ever happens, or rarely does it ever happen fast. It's crazy how many times we hear these things and just slough them off because, well, that's easier said than done, right? But it's actually true, and it doesn't, and it can't become real until we have the want to. Instead of embracing what I like to call the case of the don'ts, as in I just don't want to. That's really the case when we say we can't or that won't work, or the defeatist mantra of I'm just not that way. But the truth is, until we decide to actually do it, it's never going to happen. You just got to do it. It's kind of like waiting until you're ready. Well, chances are we're never going to be ready, so just do it. But so lately, just to catch you up on kind of my life recently. No, not recently, but just a little longer than that too. But I've been getting my health tighter, being more deliberate in my health journey. Um, like I said, it's also lately, but it's really the past couple of years. But I notice that the healthier I get, the stronger I become, and the harder and more focused my determination to become healthy becomes part of my everyday character and my lifestyle. And it's nothing complicated. It's just consistent work. It's just not giving up. You know, about a year and a half ago, I set what I call military 50 goal. And that is in 3 years. So a year and a half from now, when I turn 50, I want to be in shape according to military standards, age bracketed, of course. Cardio has been consistent. I've been rucking the park, getting those miles under load, weightlifting, resistance training, stayed in steady rotation, not giving up, doing it even if I don't feel like it. But just basic strength work, steady progression, nothing macho, just focused on health and longevity. And I went from truly believing that I wouldn't live past my 60s to kind of starting to believe that I can hit 100. Positive thinking. I mean, go big or go home, right? I know that's a saying, but it's actually true, really. And I haven't even mentioned diet. At some point, I'm going to have to do a couple episodes on diet alone. But once you dial in and understand the biological and medical side of things, real food being true medicine that does heal not just the body, but your mind and your emotions. It's awesome. But anyway, I won't say too much for now, but because that's not the topic for tonight. But we'll get there. We'll get there. eventually we'll address everything, all sides. But on the spiritual side, I've been working on a devotional prayer to prayer that I've recently written in Old English, and each morning I've been doing this for, I don't know, about 2 weeks now, maybe a little longer. But each day before beginning my day, I started off reciting it, and now I'm working in melody, kind of turning it into singing out and aloud, not just thinking it, but singing it aloud as a prayer of honor. So the prayer essentially is of course, it's modern, but it's nine-lined. It's a nine-lined poem, and it's in Old English. The specifically excuse me, stuttering here, late West Saxon Galder, in a traditional poetic diction, if you will. But the thing is I've composed it in the Eddic Ljóðháttr Galdralag. So I'm kind of combining two different forms. I'm combining well, anyway, yeah, it is different, because I'll say this, because Galdralag is traditionally an Old Norse poetry style, but with my knowledge base being primarily in Old English, I'm blending the two, which is fitting, being that I'm an American, and with Americans, so much of our faith has a strong Norse foundation, but yet the majority of us are Anglo-Saxon, or English heritage. But doing this kind of work can be slow work, as it's tedious. It requires very precise word craft. It's quite difficult, actually, and because you can't fake your way through meter and language. It's in a way, language is very mathematical. But who knows? Maybe at some point in the future, I'll compile a handful of them and put out a Galder pocketbook. But there's always projects and work to be done. Never enough time to do them. I guess if you're going to have a problem, that's a good one to have, right? Okay. That's enough for a little brief intro. But that's where I'm at anyway. So just want to catch you up on some things, building and living life one step at a time. So anyway, enough said. Shall we get into it? Let's do it. So I want to mention right off the bat that for this episode, we're likely going to forego the question and answer segment that we've previously been doing. And that's just due to the length of the topic that we're going to discuss. But I do promise we'll get back to it the next episode. And always, if you have any questions or comments or even arguments, rebuttals, send them my way. I'm always open to hear your thoughts. And I enjoy it, actually. So, but for a short bit, I want to do just a little bit of review of the last episode. But as the discussion today, it builds from it. So that's why I just want to do a little recap. And then as we progress, we'll naturally merge the recap into today's topic, because it like this episode is really just a continuation of last episode. So if you haven't listened to the last one, you can still listen to tonight's episode, and it won't throw anything off. But just go back, listen to the other one, and things will make a little bit more sense. Or if you want to stop listening now, then go back and listen to the other one. And this one, I'll post to the various platforms, within the next few days. But last time we talked about building sustainable happiness, like a long-term investment, and what it actually is and what it isn't. Like, happiness is not a constant mood. It's not a permanent high. It's not a personality trait that you're born with, and something that you either get or don't get. We framed it as something that you build, something you invest in, something that grows over time when you stop treating your inner life like a weather report. And you start treating it like a household that you're responsible for, or a garden to tend, if you will. And the model that we used gave 3 categories that shape chronic happiness. that is long-term well-being. Okay, so first, your set point. That's the baseline that you always tend to return to. That's your temperament, your default emotional climate, the kind of nervous system that you were that is your nature that you were born with. Because like some are naturally steadier people, some are naturally more reactive, some have a higher or lower threshold for stress, for novelty or disappointment. you know, this is real and it matters. You can improve your conditioning, but you can't pretend that you started with the same equipment as everyone else. Urlog and weird, that is part of the equation. Again, Urlog and weird are two aspects of the same thing, that is fate. Now, second, circumstances, the conditions around you, your work situation, your finances, your health, your social relationships, where you live, what obligations do you carry, what burdens are you under, the tangibles in your life. Like a man or someone, with chronic pain is not living the life as someone who is pain free. Uh, Someone with a stable income is not living the same life as someone who, you know, is a paycheck away from losing their house or feeding their family, because circumstances matter and we can't deny that. But then comes the part, this comes the part that where nerves begin to be felt. The part that calls us to duty. And these are the intentional activities, what you do on purpose, the repeated actions, the habits you practice, the routines you keep, the way you speak, the way you train your body, the way you guard your mind, and train your mind, the way that you carry your devotion, or how do you handle your relationships? The small, the daily, the mundane acts that make you into a certain kind of person. And here, why that framework matters is because it can correct two lies at the same time. The first lie: if I fix my circumstances, I'll be fine. Now, people say this without even noticing that they've said it. They treat happiness like it's waiting behind the next job or the next relationship or the next move, the next purchase. And sometimes, yes, improving circumstances genuinely helps. But if you're drowning, getting out of the water is what matters. So the lie is thinking that circumstances alone will rescue you from your inner disorder. We can change our situations and yet still carry the same anxieties, the same restlessness, the same bitterness, self-sabotage. And why? Because we never address the part of the equation that is our responsibility. And now here's the second lie: I'm just built that way, so nothing matters. It's not going to change. That's how I am. But when you look at that's surrender pretending to be honesty. It's defeatism. It's giving up, and yet normalizing it as something that is not. So, yes, our set point is real. And yes, some start with heavier burdens, but that 40%, that intentional part, is where character is trained. It's where you decide whether you're the kind of person who can be trusted, relied upon, and respected. And not because you demand it, but because your conduct proves it. Actions always speak louder than words. And of course, we've all been there where we've made mistakes, some more than others. And when you do change, you may not be believed right away. It may take weeks, it may take months, it may take years. And with some people, it may never happen. But that's where patience comes in, and sincerity. Okay, so here's the part that we didn't fully dwell on last time. And this is the reason why this episode exists. Intentional practice doesn't only lift your mood, but it sharpens your perception, the way that you perceive things, the way that you see things, right? When you actually begin living as if the 40% is yours to direct, when you stabilize your sleep, you stabilize your training, you get into a work rhythm, or whatever rituals that you're doing, your devotion, um, the way you're thinking, how you're thinking, something happens that most people are not prepared for. You stop needing the constant noise just to manage yourself. You stop self medicating with distraction. You stop negotiating with your weaknesses on a daily basis. And this is where we're transitioning to the next level. Because you see, for a lot of people, life is set up as a cycle of sedation. Okay. They don't call it that, but that's what it is. When they're anxious, they flood their minds with entertainment. When they're lonely, they chase attention. When they're bored, they consume the distraction of phone scrolling. When when they're uncertain, they talk louder or talk more. When they're afraid, they find something to do to keep them busy. Afraid, nerves, nervousness, it's all the same, same thing. But and it's not that any of those things are inherently bad. It's the problem is when it becomes your anesthesia, when it prevents you from seeing what's actually going on in you and around you, right? The intentional practice, that 40%, it removes the blinders, it removes the anesthesia, it unfogs your mind. And again, it's a slowly but surely, it takes time, a lot of time. And even when you get tired and wore out, keep on going. There's no other choice. If you clean up your sleep, that alone, you'll notice your thoughts become clear. If you train your body, then you'll start noticing your appetites. If you build a routine, then you'll notice your excuses. If you keep devotion, then you'll notice your inner alignment, where you're sincere and where you're just performing. And once that starts, something simple and a little unsettling occurs. You start noticing what's been there the whole time, but couldn't see it before. You notice which relationships are reciprocal and which are one way. You see who shows up and who only takes. You see who strengthens you and who uses you. And you see who respects you and who doesn't. You notice what people are doing under their words, right? You begin to hear those negotiations, the status checks, the approval bids, the dominance games, the fear of being wrong, fear of being seen. But now again, not because you're trying to become a cynic, no, but because once your own mind is calmer, the noise in other people becomes easier to detect. You notice your own motives more clearly. You notice other people's motives more clearly. And all of this is important. You see, clarity isn't just about seeing um, other people's games, okay? But it's definitely about catching your own. You start recognizing when you're speaking to be admired as opposed to speaking to be useful. When you're correcting someone to feel superior instead of the serving truth. when you're seeking comfort, but you're just calling it self-help. There's all kinds of lies that we tell ourselves. Uh, and clarity can expose that introspection. This is the real point of maturity. That clarity cuts both ways. It's a double-edged sword. Yes, it exposes the world, but it exposes you, and it can be a very hard thing to truly see yourself. If we're honest, most of us hide behind the curtain of lies. We take that curtain and we just shut it in front of our eyes, and like that's those lies that we tell ourselves, rather than you know face the fear of growing up, because growing up is hard, and it's scary. And I don't care how old you are. I don't care how smart you are or how mature you might be. It's hard. And and but seeing it brings consequences, because clarity changes how you inhabit your social life, or any social interactions. See, some of us, when we become disciplined, we expect the world to get easier socially, because generally our confidence will start to boost, and our insecurities tend to fade into the background, and we're feeling good about ourselves. We have the discipline, we got clarity, more than before anyway. But then we can become confused when things don't turn out the way we think it should be, or it's going to be. We think, I'm doing better. So why is there more friction? Why are there still friction? What's going on? I thought I was doing right. And one might think, okay, well, I'm finally stable. So with me being stable and have some confidence and seeing things a little bit more clearly, why are people feeling, why are they draining me so much? Why do I feel that drain? Why is those people's negativity harder for me to deal with? I thought I understood, and so I'm approaching it, but now it's just becoming harder for me, and here's why. Because once you stop living by impulse, you become less predictable to a world that runs on impulse. Once you stop performing, you become less soothing to people who need performance to feel comfortable. Once you stop agreeing automatically, then you become a mirror, and people don't like mirrors. This is this is also why some people, when they quit chaos and they achieve uh, some order in their lives, they feel lonely. And it's not that discipline made them depressed. It's that discipline removed the fog, the blinders. And when your inner, quote unquote, weather stabilizes, you can no longer pretend that your environment is healthy if it's not. You can no longer tolerate the same drama, because you can see it for what it is, and it's attacks on your own life force. The energy vampire is draining the life from you. And what's really hard is when you do that introspection, and when you're looking at somebody. Well, I say introspection, but just bear with me. You're looking at somebody and you're seeing how they're an energy vampire. And then when you introspect and you see, oh my God, that's how I was. Hopefully I'm not still like that to some degree. And then that's when you can, if you don't check yourself, spiral down towards that path of negativity and become depressed. But you have to guard yourself. Hold on to that clarity, and there's ways where it will not pull you down. All right. Clarity is ultimately when you get, or it's what you get when you stop constantly sedating your awareness. And clarity brings a choice, right? Either you use it to become steadier and more honorable, more restrained, more disciplined, more selective without contempt, or you use it to become contemptuous, isolated, and God's forbid, contentious. Either you translate your inner, uh, your insight, if you will, and you translate that into wisdom, or you turn it into ego. Either you preserve Frith, or you start burning bridges just to prove that you're right. And you go down the road of playing the victim until you're just an empty shell, alone and miserable. And this is why we have to distinguish knowledge, understanding, and wisdom as vital components of our life. Now, with knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, this is something that I have always thought about. Um, you know, when I was raising my children, and I would pray for them at night, I would bring up knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. But the thing is that no matter how much we look into having knowledge and gaining understanding and earning and achieving wisdom, no matter how far we've come with that in our own lives, there's still so much farther that we have to go. There's always more to learn. Okay, so let's start with knowledge. Knowledge is easy to collect, and it can even be performed. We can repeat the correct words and yet still be ruled by impulse and immaturity. But understanding takes more work. It connects things, it predicts patterns, it sees the consequences. It tends to make you quieter because it makes you cautious. Now, wisdom, that is the hardest. Wisdom is when you live what you know under the burden and cost that will naturally result. When you know how to use or not use your knowledge and understanding. So the 40%. The 40% is about becoming the kind of person who can see clearly, despite the fact that clarity has a cost. And we're going to discuss that cost, for duty is our standard. And when it reveals itself, we must, like Tyr in his hand, pay the cost. Because duty includes consequences. So we're going to train ourselves how to pay that cost correctly. So, okay, we have knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And if we don't establish this distinction early, then the rest of the episode might be a bit unclear. That's why, again, I've said it before in previous episodes. Sometimes I might repeat myself, but it's intentional. It's for emphasis. So bear with me and don't try not to think that I'm just mindlessly rambling. When people say things like, "I want to be smarter," or "I want to wake up," or "I want to see clearly," or "I choose the red pill," that usually means a dozen things to a dozen people. They're mixing categories. And that confusion is one of the reasons that they get lost, because you can accumulate information without becoming wiser, and you can become more aware without becoming more honorable. And honor is everything. Everything. So we're going to separate three things that most people treat as interchangeable. Again, the knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And I want to define them in the simplest way that I can, so that you can actually use them. Knowledge is what you can mentally collect and repeat. facts, terms, names, quotes, history, lists, the ability to say, here's what the sources claim, here's what happened, here's the information. And knowledge is necessary. Someone who has no or little knowledge, they're blind in a practical sense. Okay. And that person is easy to manipulate and easy to mislead because without knowledge, you can be controlled without even knowing that you're controlled. But having knowledge, it also has a darker shadow that can follow it. Knowledge, it can be worn like clothing. It can be performed. One can memorize the right words and still be ruled by their appetite, as I've previously said. They can be ruled by their vanity or fear or just the desire to win. One can repeat the facts, but still lack discernment. One can speak correctly and yet still act wrongly. So knowledge is valuable, but it's not the end. Now, understanding is what you can connect, explain, predict. It's connecting the dots to see the big picture, to see the forest for the trees. Understanding is when information becomes structure, when it becomes realized, when you don't just know a thing, but you can explain why it works, how it relates to other things, and what will likely happen next if certain conditions remain the same. You're able to predict with a greater degree of accuracy. Because this is the point where you start seeing the patterns. You can walk into a situation and feel where it's headed. You recognize the incentives under people's words. You notice the repeating dynamics, how certain personalities will interact, how certain environments reward certain behaviors, how certain habits produce certain outcomes. You start grasping causes, not just events. You start seeing the why and the who behind things. Understanding is more rare than knowledge because it requires integration. It requires patience. It requires the ability to hold complexity without, how should I put it, without reaching for a soundbite. Okay. But understanding, like knowledge, has its own dark shadow as well. Understanding can tempt you. Understanding can tempt you into contempt. And contempt is a very terrible thing because once you see the pattern, you start getting frustrated that other people can't or won't see it. And if you're not disciplined, that frustration can become a posture. You can start looking down. You start treating people like obstacles instead of human beings, and you become something that isn't good. And to be honest, I can attest to this more than many people. Throughout my life, I've been the one that's been smarter than most. And I'm not talking in the online world, because in the online world, I'm interact with many very, very highly intelligent people. I'm talking, real life, day-to-day life. Okay. And naturally, the majority of the times, I would have the winning argument, the truth to dispel the falsity within the given situations. But for many years, I lacked the understanding to see the big picture. And even more, I lacked the awareness to see that sometimes we don't need to win the argument, or we don't need to teach someone the things that they're uneducated in. And worse, having the understanding and believing that everyone can get that understanding, if you would just tell them, because in reality, many people just react with hostility because not everybody can or will. So understanding is powerful and it's necessary, but it still isn't the end, because you have knowledge and then you have understanding about that knowledge, but then the next thing, wisdom. And wisdom is what you choose and what you do under the cost. Wisdom is not just insight, it's discernment and judgment. It's the ability to take what you know and what you understand and turn it into right action, especially when it costs you something. Wisdom is the path to being honorable. Wisdom is restraint when you could embarrass someone. Wisdom is choosing the path that helps the person when oftentimes helping them is holding back information because they might not be ready for it. Wisdom is silence when speaking would only make you feel powerful. You know, wisdom is choosing the right time, the right person, the right words. Wisdom is doing what is right for the greater good, even when it's inconvenient, unpopular, or lonely. Wisdom isn't just quote unquote good decisions. Wisdom is the kind of judgment that builds and preserves relationships. Your word kept, your integrity intact, and it strengthens Frith and stabilizes trust. That's why I say wisdom has weight, because it is tied to consequences. It is tied to reputation, to bonds, to duty, to household, to the folk, to our relationships. Wisdom is a way of moving through the world that does not create unnecessary negative impacts. Okay. And this is what I've learned in life. Knowledge helps you grow, and understanding opens your mind, but wisdom helps you navigate. Knowledge. I know this and I can repeat it. Understanding. I can explain it. I can see the origins. I can predict outcomes. But wisdom. I know what to do or say in any given situation. Now, now trust me, knowledge is great and understanding changes everything in your life. But without wisdom, you'll likely spend too much time in just frustration and pain, frustrated at not being able to share with others on the level that you're at, and having the pain of likely being rejected by the very people that you're trying to reach. Now, here's going back to the title of the episode, The Cost of Clarity. Clarity is often mistaken for knowledge. People can think clarity means, well, I learned something new. But clarity is more often the result of understanding. Uh, it's pattern recognition. It's the fog lifting because you've stabilized your life enough to actually see, right? So once clarity shows up, it presses you towards wisdom, because if you see more clearly, you begin to learn that you're responsible for what you do with that sight. And then this is where the cost enters. Duty has a cost, because knowledge is socially safe in many places. You can collect facts and still be agreeable. When done with the right amount of charisma, which is the right mixture of competence and warmth, you can be the quote unquote interesting one. But understanding starts to change how you respond to the games, the drama, to sloppy speech, to shallow incentives, right? And wisdom, real wisdom, requires choices that will sometimes isolate you. Now, we need to talk about a learning curve that most experience. And I want to do it in a way that doesn't insult anyone, because this is not about superiority. This is about being honest and being humble. It's about training our judgment, training ourselves, helping ourselves become better. And ultimately, that is the true heathen way. The true sedish way is always striving for better, never settling for mediocrity, but remembering that effort is worth more than result. So here's the curve, okay? Early learning often produces confidence before calibration, right? So let me spell it out like this. When you first encounter a subject, whether it's religion, psychology, strength training, history, whatever, you pick up a few concepts and you feel like you've got it, right? Well, that early confidence, you can't run with that too much. Sometimes it's just relief, as in finally something makes sense, and you latch onto that. And that relief can feel like certainty. But if you keep going, if you actually study, practice, and test yourself, then you hit another stage. And that deeper learning produces humility, because then you finally see the size, the scope of that subject. And then you realize how many variables that you didn't account for, how much context you missed, how many things you assumed. You discover the difference between repeating something and understanding it. You start noticing that the people who actually know what they're talking about, how they speak with more caution, not more swagger. They're more humble. They're slower to speak. Because I've always heard it put this way. It's something very common. It's like, yeah, that person knows just enough to be dangerous. And this is what I'm talking about. We don't want to be like that person who learns and gets some knowledge and then just wants to run with it when they're not ready, when we're not ready, right? So again, if you keep going again, if you keep practicing, keep failing, keep getting back up again, keep returning to discipline, you'll eventually reach a maturity that has a different sound to it. Maturity speaks with restraint because it has paid for many mistakes. It's paid the cost time and time again. Now, someone who has paid for being careless, they measure their words. They choose where to speak. They understand that saying the right thing at the wrong time can be worse than saying nothing. They understand that an argument won't always produce truth, and that correction isn't always a virtue. The danger is being certain about something that hasn't been tested by consequences. Someone can learn, someone can ask questions, someone can improve. But untested certainty can be stubborn, and it makes one restless. It makes one loud. It makes one defend their pride instead of examining their beliefs. And it creates a social conflict, because it turns conversation into a battlefield, and it's tiresome. And we don't want to be the one that just gets tired from the constant battle, but also we don't want to be the one that tires other people. And essentially what I've been speaking, is that of the overconfidence effect, right? When we take our feeling of certainty as proof that we actually have the right answer. And there's an important difference between how well we actually understand something with how certain we feel about it. And there's two kinds of people, okay? The one who learns just enough to become dangerous, as I've said, and he has some knowledge, becomes overconfident, and thinks he knows more than he does because he doesn't know what he doesn't know. Then there's the other, the one who has gone further and learned more, achieved clarity, and realizes what he doesn't know. So his humility produces cautiousness. The one who knows less will believe that he knows the most and tends to speak way too much, while the one who knows the most will often speak the least. So why am I bringing this up in an episode called The Cost of Clarity? Because clarity changes your relationship to certainty. When you start seeing patterns, you become less impressed by loudness. You become less moved by confident performances. And you start noticing when people are speaking from fear or from status, or if they're speaking from the need to be right. But as previously mentioned, if you're not careful, then you'll start treating everyone like they're an idiot. And we don't want to do that. That's terrible, you know. Or you might start treating yourself as if you're an exile. Both of those are wrong. So the discipline is to stay clear without being rude or mean, to stay aware but not be conceited, to be selective without having contempt for others, to carry strength without building an identity around being misunderstood or building an identity of the one who's always ignored. Because that puts you in a wrong frame of mind. And that wrong frame of mind will bleed into every action that you do in life. It's like putting those blinders on. And we're working on taking those blinders off. And that's what I'm trying to convey. So why does clarity cost us socially? Why does seeing more clearly change our social interactions? Even if we're not trying to be disruptive, right? So how can we connect this with the Lord? Because we always do need to go back to the Lord. That is our home base. That is where we find our answers. Because it's in there, it's in there. Is there a story that teaches this? When a truth seeker steps into a situation that's not built to reward clarity? Well, I think there is. And on the Frithstead, I've been posting some of it recently, Frithstead. And it's about what happens when a someone who's seeking truth, they walk into a situation that's not built for comfort. Okay, and this is a tale about how knowledge can become pressure and how speech has risk and how wisdom is shown. And it begins with Odin speaking to Frigg, and he tells her that he wants to go to the all-wise Jotun Vathuthnir for a visit. He just wants to go see him, visit. He wants to have a discussion in the ancient lore. But Frigg warns him in the hall, or that his hall is dangerous, right? And that Vathuthnir is very powerful and is possibly the most powerful Jotun. So right off the bat, Odin wants to prove what he knows. And we immediately hear a warning, words expressing caution. We hear how restraint needs to be shown. But Odin insists regardless. And he says that he has traveled much, he's experienced a lot of things, and he's learned quite a bit. But he wants to know what it's like in Vathuthnir's hall. And so he chooses the danger for the sake of knowing. Now, the first point that we need to take from this is that this is not casual curiosity. This is calculated and willed risk for the sake of gaining understanding. Because understanding and wisdom have a cost. Clarity has a price, and that price is never paid with ease or with comfort. Clarity begins with a choice, and all choices have consequences. So Othin goes, and he goes under a traveling name, Gaganrather. And so he enters the Jotun's Hall, and right off the bat, the first thing that happens is a challenge. Vafthrûdnir asks, in essence, okay, who are you? Why are you speaking in my hall? And then he says something that's important. You shall never leave from this place if you are not wiser. So before anything else, Vafthrûdnir establishes his position of power, and that threat is real, and the danger is present. The terms have been set, if you will. And this is a reminder that as we progress in life, environments are never neutral. There are always rules in every situation, no matter where it is. And these rules, some are spoken, but many are not. So, as is custom, Gaganrather, Odin, asks for hospitality. And he frames himself as a traveler, thirsty, having come far. He's needing reception. Now, in our culture, which we received from Heimdall, this isn't considered a weakness, but it's proper procedure. Showing hospitality is a hallmark of our gods, whom we emulate. Odin's making the correct. His request is correct, and it's in the right form. So he's following protocol, the cultural protocol. But notice this: even hospitality always has a hierarchy. It always goes back to the rules. There's always rules. And, before questions, dialogue, situations even start, every situation has its terms. And within the greater context of what we've been discussing, it's not necessarily written terms, but it's social terms. Who's being treated as credible? Who's being tested? What tone is acceptable? What subjects are safe? What kind of truth is welcome? And what kind of truth is treated as trouble or irritation? Because people don't just listen to what you say, they listen to what it means in that moment. Does it embarrass someone? Does it challenge the group's comfort? Does it force a change nobody wants to make? Does it shift who has status? And this is why a lot of conversations aren't only about understanding, but they're also about belonging. And if you act like every setting is neutral, you'll keep paying unnecessary costs, and not necessarily for being wrong, but for ignoring the terms that were already in force, that were already in place. Now, in this encounter, okay, notice that the first test isn't facts. It's whether Odin can enter a hostile place without losing himself, if you will. Vafthrûdnir calls out something practical. Why are you speaking from the floor? Take a seat. Sit in the hall. Then we will see which one of us knows more. The guest or the old speaker? Gaganrather answers. And notice he has restraint and high social intelligence. He doesn't puff up or bow up. He doesn't over-explain. And he just gives a rule. A poor man who comes to a rich man should either speak usefully or hold his tongue, because too much talk does him no good in the presence of a stern man. That one line contains a whole discipline, which is not every room is yours, and not every audience deserves your full depth So don't pour out every truth just because you possess it. Wisdom, restraint, timing. Now, this is a point that I would like to say is a persona point. Okay. A controlled mask is not necessarily deception, but it can be a boundary. It can be the way that you preserve yourself while navigating a situation when that situation very well likely will punish your missteps. And it also teaches selective disclosure. You don't spill your whole mind on the floor in someone else's house. You measure, you test, you speak with purpose. And right there, the Lord gives us the social discipline. Don't waste your best words in a situation that won't yield the best return. But now we have the test. Knowledge is pressure, not necessarily performance. So then the questions come, right? So they trade questions about the order of the world, day and night, boundaries between powers, the place where battles are met, the origins of things, the winds, fate, what comes at the end, what survives after ruin. They go through all these things back and forth. And, we can get lost in the details if we just treat this like a lore quiz. So don't treat it like a lore quiz. The point isn't that you can name everything and recite the lore from memory. The point is the posture, calm precision under stress. There is no flailing, there's no pleading, there's no performance for applause. There's just measured speech. And this is why this story is a good illustration for our modern lives, because many conversations are not learning together, if you will. They the conversations can tend to be contests of sorts. Okay. Status regulation, dominance checks disguised as discussion. When knowledge becomes a contest, it stops being about shared understanding and it starts being about hierarchy. Well, who sits where? Who speaks? Who is permitted to be right? Dare I say, cults of personality? But then comes the turning point, the moment that shows the difference between knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Now, the final question is not about the cosmos. It's not about horses or winds or origins. It's personal and it's decisive. What did Odin say in his son's ear before he was laid on the pyre? Now, that question does something different than the others. It reveals identity and it forces recognition and it collapses the game. Vafthrûdnir realizes who he was speaking with, and with that realization, the contest ends. Not because more facts were supplied necessarily, but because deeper understanding was reached. The situation changes when truth is recognized. Knowledge answers many questions. Understanding recognizes what the questions mean, but wisdom knows when to ask the decisive questions, and it accepts the consequences of asking them. So the lesson in all of this is discipline, not domination. And notice how it ends. The Jotun concedes. He acknowledges that he has contended with Odin in knowledge, and he names Odin as the wisest. There's no gloating, no victory dance, if you will. The moral stays intact. The point isn't humiliation either. The point is to show how truth is carried with composure. And even in a contest, dignity remains. And that matters because if you take clarity and you use it to crush, you don't become wise. You'll just become corrosive. You become the problem. And wisdom does not require cruelty. So what rule can we learn? What can we take and learn from this? And it's that not every situation requires us to tell all we know. Not every person is owed our full mind. Wisdom includes restraint, timing, and a clean withdrawal, knowing when it's time to go. And if you don't learn that, then you'll bleed yourself out trying to be understood by people who are not built to receive what you're offering. And then you'll become either bitter, or you could be a shadow banned ghost. And you definitely don't want to go down that. I do have experience there. All right. So, the cost of clarity. There is a cost of clarity in the situations that we find ourselves in. So let's bring this forward, because the point of the lore is not just to admire it as, quote unquote, cool stories, but to recognize the pattern that we find within the lore applicable to our lives. Most of us don't live in a neutral world of calm dialogue and shared pursuit of truth. We live in situations where speech is currency, where status is constantly being negotiated, and where people are protecting something, whether they admit it or not. Now, I'm going to give you some lenses that help you interpret what you might be experiencing, because if you can interpret correctly, then you stop taking things personally and you stop paying the price wrong. So the first lens we could call the drive lens. Okay, the drive lens. A lot of human behavior is not driven by careful reasoning. It's driven by relief seeking, craving, avoidance, comfort, validation, control. People want the tension to just go away. They want to feel safe. They want their status protected. They want their identity affirmed. That drive is often stronger than the desire to know truth. Okay. And then the second lens is the mask lens. The mask lens. All right. People aren't just talking to exchange information. They're protecting a social self, a persona, a role that keeps them accepted and unthreatened. Belonging is not an abstract idea, it's a survival signal. So many people will sacrifice truth for harmony, and not because they're bad people, but it's because the cost of standing alone, it feels like danger. It's uncomfortable and it's scary. So the third lens is the discipline lens. With the discipline lens, your freedom. Your freedom is in what you can govern. Okay, your judgments and your actions. The outcomes belong to fate. You don't control how other people react, what they believe, or what they choose to accept or reject, but you control your conduct, your restraint, your timing, your boundaries, your speech, your duty. So put those three lenses together and your experience becomes clearer. Clarity creates friction because you are less easily steered by the usual levers. And what levers do I mean? I mean things like you're less easily steered by fear or approval or comfort or herd mentality. When you stop being driven by impulse, you do become harder to steer that way. And that's where the friction starts. So at this point, we're going to delve into the costs of clarity, specific costs. and we have 4 of them. So the first cost is social exhaustion and boredom, right? A lot of talk is not aimed at understanding, right? It's aimed at regulation and bonding. People talk to maintain connection. They want their tension reduced. They talk for signal agreement, um, to establish who stands where. And but those things are not always bad. Like a lot of the things I've been saying. It's just, you don't want to take things too far, and you want to just understand things for what they are. A healthy community needs bonding, but if you're trying to live deliberately, you start noticing how much conversation is simply just, quote unquote, managing the room. And I get it. You get tired, not from speaking, but from compressing. You feel like you're constantly adjusting your words, your tone, your depth, your level of honesty, your pace, just to keep other people comfortable. It's like you're translating your mind to fit the language of the room. And when you do that for too long, you start to feel hollow, like you've spent energy without gaining anything real. And this is where people say, I'm tired of small talk. But it's not always small talk. Sometimes it's the constant restraint that can be draining. So, what can we do? We got to stop demanding depth from every conversation, because a lot of people just aren't built for depth. Most people are not trying to explore reality and to go, quote unquote, deep. They'll wonder why, but they'll never truly seek to know the why. They're trying to maintain a connection with people. They don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to feel conflict, and they just want to be comfortable and have an enjoyable, conversation and bonding experience. But when we're socially exhausted and bored with the level of conversations, the correction is to reserve full depth for the earned bonds, for the select few who can carry it, who do want it, and who won't punish you for being honest. Because if you insist on full depth in every room, you will either become resentful or you will just isolate yourself. And God forbid you blame others for that isolation. Neither of those things is wisdom. Wisdom is selecting the right speech with the right person at the right time. Boredom is manageable. The more difficult problem is the games, which the games is the second cost. Well, that is the disgust of the games. Now, I do want to say that out of these 4 costs, that doesn't mean that you will experience all 4 of those. But, some people do experience all 4. Some may only experience 1 or a couple or 3. But these are just the general things that are found to be common. So games, right? You see systems that are in place, the structures within our life, within reality. They reward appearance more than substance, if we're actually honest. Okay. Workplaces reward the image of competence more than competence itself. Communities tend to reward the image of virtue. Groups reward loyalty to the tribe more than loyalty to truth. And the more that you see that, the harder it can become to pretend that you don't see it. And then this is when you start noticing incentives beneath the language. People are not just stating opinions, they're protecting their place. They're performing the correct stance. They're avoiding the risk of being wrong. They're saying what's safe, not what's primarily or necessarily true. And when we've achieved clarity, seeing these unspoken social games It can make us impatient and disdainful. And it's not because you hate people, but because you hate the waste of time, the waste of honesty, the waste of effort. You begin to feel like you're watching theater when you came for reality. And then you face a temptation to become a wrecking ball, to just say the truth bluntly, constantly, like a bull in a china closet, as if bluntness itself is a virtue, but it's not. Wisdom dictates that in most daily day-to-day situations, restraint must govern us. A persona used intentionally does not have to be a lie. Like I said, it can be a boundary. It can be the way you navigate the collective without being consumed by it. Order maintained by restraint, timing, and honor. Truth, because truth without timing becomes demolition. And demolition is easy. Any fool can burn a bridge. Wisdom is knowing when to speak, what to say, and what will happen when you say it. So again, the goal is not to win every contest. The goal is to keep relationships strong while preserving your own steadfastness. And sometimes that means you don't correct. Sometimes you let someone be wrong. Sometimes you just stay quiet, or sometimes you leave. Now we have the third cost, okay? Psychological contamination. Sensitivity without what we can call containers, if you will. It means you absorb the room, okay? There are some of us that pick up the emotions like an empath. We read the shifts in reality, the tension, the envy, the insecurity, the aggression, the desperation, and we can see that in others, even if they cannot see it in themselves. It's almost like if you've heard of the term micro expression, something that all humans do, because we have our normal facial expressions, and those are the things that are like your conscious mind that you know that you're giving. But then we have micro expressions, and that's like the subconscious that we don't know that we're doing, but it still will be an indicator of what we're truly feeling, even if we're not admitting it to ourselves. So, we may not even be thinking about it, but our nervous system just registers it. We feel it, and if we don't have any containers, then we carry it home with us. And you know what I mean by containers, is something that holds us in check. Okay, experientially, those of us who are like this, we leave feeling agitated or drained or depressed. And you can walk into a gathering and you're fine, but when you leave, you feel mentally drained and exhausted, and your mind spins, your body is tense, and you feel like you're in a hazy dream. You replay conversations, so you become irritable or heavy feeling, or you become numb, and you start avoiding people entirely. And it's not because you despise them, but because the exposure costs too much and it wears you out. You feel physically exhausted because, you know, psychological will affect the physical. So if you're feeling some of these things after, interacting, with quote unquote normies, it's likely that your boundaries and recovery systems aren't trained enough yet. So that begs the question, how do we train them? We act in our best interests. Okay. We learn how long we can stay in certain rooms before we start paying the cost that takes its toll on us. We find a way where we can decompress. We get away and be alone for a bit, or go to someone we can have a deeper conversation with. We slow down, and we find the feeling of gratitude for the positives that surround us. And gratitude is the ultimate healing emotion. When you feel gratitude, negativity cannot exist. It is impossible. If your mind is valuable, you treat it like a household. You don't just leave the door open and then act surprised when the house fills with smoke or bugs flying in or unwanted anything, You just have to learn to tend yourself. So this brings us to the fourth cost of clarity, and that's labeling and soft exclusion. Now, groups tend to punish deviation. They punish deviation to preserve cohesion. And it's not always with open attack, it's often with quiet measures. Fewer invitations, less warmth, less opportunity, less trust, or the big one, shadow banning. You know, humans enforce norms. If you don't mirror the group, then the group can read that as a threat, even if you've said nothing. And it's not because they're bad, of course. They're not our enemies, but it's because cohesion is a survival mechanism. We might feel that, well, they think I'm just arrogant, or they think I'm weird, or I just don't fit. Sometimes sometimes you earn it. Sometimes your tone could be sharp, or your patience is low, or your contempt leaks out, and that's your failings. And when we have our failings, we got to own it. We've got to own it. But sometimes you can get labeled simply because you don't perform the way that everyone else does. You might not laugh on cue, or you don't echo the slogans. You don't pretend enthusiasm. You don't, quote unquote, join in. But they remember the times you let it slip and you've exposed too much, or when they knew that you saw behind the masks. And people can and will interpret that as a threat because they're used to mutual performance as well as mutual reassurance. So with these, we have two corrections. And I like to say, check your shadow. So if your clarity has turned into impatience or contempt or meanness, just admit it to yourself and correct it. Not for their comfort, but for your integrity. Because vanity and pride is only going to destroy you. And the second correction is, don't use your illusions. Don't build an identity around exile. Don't turn being misunderstood into your personality. That loop feels empowering for a while, but it turns dark and it makes you bitter and it makes you contentious, and it makes you incapable of giving and receiving love. And without love, we have nothing. Love is the main goal in life, is to have that. Wisdom, again, is not I stand alone because I'm better. It's I stand where duty requires, and I choose bonds carefully without hatred or contempt. So this is the point that where people will get tempted into another lie. And that lie is this: well, the world is shallow and I'm deep. But that lie is poison because it removes responsibility, and it turns clarity into ego, and it turns deed into theater. It just flips the script. Instead of chasing approval, you chase specialness. Okay, so let's add one more stabilizer. All right. People are not identical. People are not identical. Each have their own 50% baseline. And if we forget that, then we risk becoming contemptuous. People are different. Some have Some are high in openness, mentally and emotionally extroverted, where ideas matter to them, nuance matters. Whereas, well, some are more closed off. They hold back. They're more shielded. They want the known, the familiar, the practical. They just want what's safe. And some people are high in a conscientious order. They need structure, predictability. And then others could be looser and just live by improvisation, spontaneity, excitement. Um, some recharge with solitude, but others recharge with people. Some are more naturally agreeable, others are more combative, and some more reactive, some steadier. It's just how it is. Some have anger issues, whereas others can just let things go, no problem. Some are naturally more depressive, and others seem to maintain this strength of happiness where every time you see them, there's joy on their face, and it's like, oh, okay. When you look at someone who's always depressed or always happy, it's like you can wonder, how are they like that? Why are they like that? But it's just the way it is sometimes. And that's why the training comes in handy, so you can correct yourself. And but variation in how people are, it isn't a moral ranking. It's just life. It's just people. Understanding that the terrain of humanity, it can help you translate. It can help you to wisely pick the situations that you find yourself in, and it helps you stop demanding the same depth from everyone, and it helps you to learn to speak in a way that can be received. So don't hate people. You know, the answer is never to become a lone wolf. The answer is discipline. Be a fortress with a hearth. A fortress has boundaries. It's selectivity. It has self-command. With a hearth that has true bonds, devotion, and a few people who can truly be with you while you're being truly you, without them demanding anything from you. So, okay, continuing on. Um, let's see. We've discussed the costs, some corrections. I want to go into just a few protocols, the things that, like, what to do, what to stop doing, how to pay the price correctly. I want to make things practical, and this is the part where we stop, let's say, admiring the problem and we start training for it. So everything we've covered so far, in the past hour and a half, how knowledge needs understanding and understanding needs wisdom, and how these three bring clarity, which can easily cause us a separation from a lot of people in our normal day-to-day lives. But how we have a duty to search for, to fight for, to achieve clarity. How do we achieve clarity despite the costs, right? To analyze ourselves, to find ourselves useful and able to turn our deeds into repeatable conduct, not changing moods of a good and bad roller coaster of actions, but just finding that steadfastness. There's a couple quotes that I wrote down, because I find them inspiring and very applicable. One of my favorite poems of all time, "The Raven" by Edgar Allan Poe, and it's this quote here: "Deep into the darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before." Now that quote leads into Nietzsche's quote that goes, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And when you look long into the abyss also looks into you." And those two quotes go so well together. So this is what we must do, and we must train our minds to be strong, disciplined, resolute, steadfast. So, of course, it's imperative that we look into the abyss. And like Odin, who 9 nights, wounded by his spear, gave himself to himself on that tree, we too must expose ourselves to root out our flaws and our inadequacies. So, the protocols, field rules, if you will, a way to move through the situations. You don't need a ton of information or a list of principles a mile long. You just need a few that you can remember when under pressure. Rule 1, and again, I repeat myself sometimes, but it's for emphasis. It's for the giving of clarity. Rule 1, stop demanding depth from the average room. Again, most rooms are built for coordination and comfort, not truth seeking. And if you keep expecting deep understanding from people who didn't ask for it or can't carry it, then you'll create frustration in yourself and resistance in them. So save your full depth for earned bonds, for those who can handle it. Now, rule 2, wear persona on purpose as a tool, but just not your identity. A persona is not automatically a lie. It's a boundary, and it's how you move through the collective without handing your whole mind to the room. The mistake is both not having a mask as well as forgetting that you're wearing it. It's something to use intentionally, measured, focused, functional. Now, rule 3, practice insight. Clarity is not bluntness, and truth should not be a wrecking ball. One can speak true words and still act like a fool if he speaks them at the wrong time, in the wrong way, to the wrong person. Clarity is seeing the thing, but wisdom is delivering it in a form that preserves good relations, or choosing silence when speech would only create something negative. Rule 4, select bonds without contempt. Keep a small but high quality circle for the trusted. And with your wider circle, just maintain functional respect. Because remember, you don't need to exile yourself to protect your mind. Build a few true ties and keep the rest civil and measured. Okay, rule 5. Schedule solitude as duty and don't think of it as avoidance. Solitude is either a recovery or a hiding place. If you schedule it, use it and come back stronger. It's recovery. Think Superman's Fortress of Solitude. If you disappear and call it peace while avoiding your obligations, well, that's just avoidance. So use solitude to restore and build, then return to the social world. Rule 6, do a weekly shadow audit. All right. Hold on a second. Okay. All right, I'm still going. I thought I might have cut out for a minute. Looks like I'm still going. Yes. Okay. Rule 6, do a weekly shadow audit. Okay, so once a week, ask 2 questions and answer them honestly. Where did vanity drive me this week? Where did fear drive me this week? If you don't audit yourself, you'll start calling your weaknesses principles, and that's a slow, destructive path. Okay? Our inner lives run on a simple loop, and it goes like this: impression, judgment, emotion, action. Okay, something happens, you perceive it, then you make a judgment about what it means. The judgment produces emotion, and emotion pushes action, okay? Like a chain of events. Most people try to control themselves at the end of the chain, at action, when they're already caught up in the moment. But that's when it's too late. See, before you react, check your judgment. Don't let the situation write your inner law. Ask yourself, what actually happened? What am I telling myself about it? What would a disciplined individual do? Pausing and thinking about our impressions before we form a judgment can save countless arguments. Now, here's a good morning routine. Set your intention. See, I've discovered that when I sing or speak to the gods in prayer each morning, in approaching them with the righteous will, it helps me set my intention. I tell myself virtue first. Relationships will improve. There'll be no needless conflict. Now, in a job that I despise, I'm finding that starting the day off with in this way by setting my intention, I'm becoming happier at work and I'm maintaining a peaceful attitude for longer. When before, to be honest, I was just a miserable grump. You know, I can admit it, but it's you learn to move on. You learn to grow. That's slow but steady, as I said. Okay, so start this now. Decide ahead of time what kind of person you're going to be today. Because if you don't decide, then the day will decide for you. Others will decide for you. Maybe you tell yourself, today I will speak usefully or not at all. I'll avoid negative comments. I'm not going to seek social approval, but I'll be friendly and I'm not going to be an energy vampire. I'll be a drenger, a friendly face to those I encounter. I'm going to do my duty. Just they're affirmations. And a lot of people can knock affirmations, but they work. They literally work, and well, I mentioned Dranger. So as a reminder, we covered the Drangskopper in episode 3. Um, Loyalty, um, determination, courage, justice, generosity, honesty, composure, mercy, integrity. These are the things of being a Dranger. What we're to strive for, and we're not going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes, but that's the pedestal that we want to rise to. So that's what you do in your morning time. So about midday, maybe after lunch, just do a quick check. Ask yourself, am I chasing social approval? Have I sucked the air out of the room like an energy vampire? Or am I doing my duty? Am I hitting some or all of the Drangskopper code? These questions catch most of our drifting, the people pleasing, the argument hunger, the social status anxiety, or any performative virtue signaling that might creep in. If the answer to those questions, if any of them are negative, then okay, I need to course correct immediately. Maybe shorten the conversations, change the tasks, just go back to work. But most of all, again, allow the gratitude to pull you out of the negativity cycle, because gratitude will change and it'll reset your emotional baseline back to the good. And then again, do this again in the evening time. What like you ask yourself later on that evening, okay, the day has passed. Where did I fail? Was it small? Was it large? Did I speak too much? If I did, when? How? Where did I avoid what I knew I should do? What do I need to repair tomorrow on what I messed up today? How can I repair what's needed without making it seem like a big deal? Because you don't want to do that. That could just make things more awkward or worse. Um, it's practiced like this. How you stay honest without becoming self-hating. We introspect, we audit, we repair, we repeat over and over again every single day. So winding all of this down, let's just put some moral weight on our tongues, because most most failings enter our lives through our speech. As the Anglo-Saxon rune poem illustrates, the mouth is the source of all language, a pillar of wisdom, and a comfort to wise men, and a blessing and a joy to everyone. Truthfulness should be our baseline, but disclosure is discretionary. We must be honest, but not too honest, and certainly not with everyone. Not every truth must be spoken, and not every thought must be shared. Prudence governs what you reveal and when. Promise carefully. That is, pledge carefully. Your word is part of your reputation and your stability. Don't promise just to impress or to feel accepted or needed. Don't promise just to soothe someone's anxiety. Only promise what you can keep. Sometimes it's needed to just say no, even if the appeal to feel needed is stronger and more comforting. But just remember, comfort seeking usually leads to ruin. Now, oaths need to be sworn very rarely. Again, oaths are much heavier than a promise, than a pledge. They're higher. They're sacred vows that run deep. They bind identity and order, and then they last into the afterlife when we stand before the hell thing. So we have to treat our oaths as sacred weight. One who swears casually is one who will break himself casually and cannot be trusted. So, what's a practical approach to gatherings, to meetings, events, or any situation that can drain you if you're not prepared? Just think of it in 3 phases. You got the before, the during, the after. Before, you set the terms, your intention. Why are you going? What duty are you fulfilling? You have a time limit. Decide in advance when you're leaving. Have an exit plan. How will you leave peacefully? What's your energy budget? How much depth do you have to give? And then during, it's courtesy plus measurement. You be warm, but don't overdo it. Avoid the correction mode unless you can be certain that it'll be received and useful. If you feel yourself tightening, well, then take a break, step outside, get water, reset. Use short, neutral lines to close up dead end topics. You can just say phrases like "fair enough" or "that's an interesting take." And then after, there's a short and selective follow-up that you do to yourself. Okay, again, you ask yourself, what worked, what drained you, what can you change next time? And follow up only where there's real potential of return effort. You don't chase people to prove your worth. And this is how you move through the world with steadiness, neither naive nor contemptuous, but disciplined. And if you do these things consistently, you'll notice the larger promise of this episode start to come true. That clarity stops feeling like a curse because you're no longer paying for it with bitterness, anger, loneliness, or isolation. You're paying for it with precision and boundaries and protectionary conduct, as well as a healthy dose of realism. So, okay, we need to close. Been going on for quite a while. And so this is where we'll leave it for this episode. Okay. Clarity is not there to make us hard, superior, endlessly corrective. It's there to make us steadier, more disciplined, and more responsible for the weight of our words and attitudes. If we can learn when to speak, when to hold back, and how to carry truth without turning it into vanity or something forceful, then we are ready. We're already ready to go further down the path than most. So, in the next episode, since we skipped the Q&A this time, I want to return to the remaining submitted questions, and there'll be questions that talk about practice and belonging, symbol sources. Some of the questions get into a few of the larger tensions, that just sit behind things. But after that episode, then we're going to move forward into the next stretch of this series that we've been doing. because really episodes 3, 4, and this one is following a progression that I'm going to continue with episodes 7, 8, and 9, and possibly further. We'll see. But a little bit of teaser here, looking ahead at episode 7, being that episode 6 next time will be, a lot of Q&A. But episode 7, probably I'll say, is likely to be a full episode on fate. But until then, I'll leave you with some advice. Tend your speech, keep your word, and be deliberate about what you give your depth to. And with that, we'll conclude this episode. And I thank you for joining me. With much, much appreciation from my heart. Our task is simple, meet life with courage, honor, and good intentions. And remember, weird bit full red swagath ahio swahio shall. Fate is fully fixed, and she goes ever as she shall. So until next time, stay strong, stay true, and hold fast to your faith, your kin, and your folk. Hail the gods, hail the folk, hail the ancestors, and hail the Frithstead. I'll see you on the next one.